I randomly chose these individuals because they happened to be on that side of the barrier when it was established. And these individuals are a random sample of the barrier, and that sampling error through random sampling means that I do not expect these individuals to be genetically identical to those. Now, on these two sides, there may be slightly different environments that are working here, and that means that natural selection as a process may select for slightly different alleles on this side versus that side. Is that okay? And the selection of these alleles means that I'm starting to get genetic differentiation that's being enforced by a natural selection type process. Females on these two sides of the barrier may prefer different male traits as a consequence of the alleles that they have, right? There's a genetic basis to their attraction, and that gets enforced as sexual selection at the level of the population, okay? And anytime I produce offspring, I go through a DNA replication stage, which means that mutation is operating as well. So 4 of the 5 evolutionary forces are now working on these populations independent of each other, simply because the barrier blocks the 5th evolutionary force. Migration tends to homogenize populations, right? Whereas these other forces are working to differentiate the populations. Genetic drift, the founder effect, natural selection, sexual selection, and mutation are making this population different from this one. If the barrier weren't there, migration would mix everything together. But migration can't mix everything together, so these two populations are staying separate. Now, natural selection gets its own special discussion because of all these evolutionary forces. Natural selection is the only one that results in adaptation. So as natural selection works on these populations, it's trying to make this group of individuals over time, right, generation after generation, more fit to this environment, whereas natural selection is operating slightly differently on this group of individuals to push them to a better fit to their environment. Make sense? Now, natural selection produces adaptations. Genetic drift, the founder effect, selection, and mutation do not produce adaptations. In fact, they routinely work against natural selection. Because I shrunk the size of the population here relative to here, I increased the strength of genetic drift relative to natural selection. Mutation works against selection. Sexual selection works against natural selection. The founder effect messed everything up. So as an evolutionary force, this allopatric speciation model is interesting to us because initially what happens is we get a decreased adaptation to the environment that has to be worked on to produce the adaptations in the long term. Right? We've increased the strength of these other evolutionary forces relative to natural selection. We've increased their strength. We've decreased the ability of these populations to adapt, at least in the short term, until natural selection can get a handle on things. But my point is, the very act of establishing the barrier, it lowers the fitness of this species as a whole. So the allopatric speciation model is kind of funny because it takes the fitness of that group of individuals and drives it down before it can come back up again. So some people have described this allopatric speciation model as a model that is working against natural selection to make it harder for these adaptations to occur. Okay? Doing all right? Okay. When I do allopatric speciation in MCB, I often talk about genetic differentiation increasing and increasing in these two populations until we reach some point where we establish a reproductive barrier. Right? The populations have become different enough genetically that there is now a reproductive isolation mechanism that's in place. The physical barrier over the long term led to a reproductive barrier, which leads to these now being considered two different species, when in the distant past they used to be the same species. How long this process takes and how much differentiation has to occur is still under a lot of debate. Okay? But when I do this in EBE, these you should recognize as isolation mechanisms that we talked about, right? The genetic differentiation led to them being in different places. They don't get together. The genetic differentiation led to them reproducing at different times of the year. They no longer can produce offspring together. They don't recognize each other. There are differences in how they reproduce, how the gametes find each other, differences in the quality of offspring that are produced between these two. So species A and species B came together and hybridized. You wouldn't get a new species because that hybrid individual has all these issues. You doing okay? All right. Okay. On the other hand, the sympatric speciation model is a little different. And I've left these in here so you could remind yourself of these different isolation mechanisms that we talked about a long time ago in EBE. But I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it because I want to deal with the consequences of this. All right, now sympatric speciation as a model, we think this is the one that happened more often than allopatric. That the sympatric speciation model explains most of the new species that are on the planet. What's happening here is typically species A produces two species, and unlike this gradual change that has to occur with allopatric speciation, this new change resulted in a very quick production of a new species, and along with it, this new species is better adapted to the environment somehow than the original species. That's model one. Most of these mechanisms involve changes in chromosomes. One of the most common ones is translocations. So during meiosis, you can take the tetrads being formed here and here, but by chance, this one got close enough to this one, and we got crossing over occurring between non-homologous chromosomes. That's a no-no. And when it happens, you get this thing called a translocation. So this slide is just to show you that sometimes these translocations can yield different numbers of chromosomes in individuals and different types of chromosomes, longer ones where the translocation was received, right? If I move this piece over to here, I now have a shortened chromatid here and a lengthened one over there. I've changed the chromosome in terms of what information is on that chromosome. So between you and me, there are lots of species groups where these changes in chromosome number through translocations and through errors in meiosis very quickly lead to new species, and they seem to have appeared very quickly on the planet. So the horse group, that would be the zebras, horses, donkeys, etc. That group, the individuals differ from each other in very small differences in chromosome number or in types of chromosomes that were formed during these translocations. Okay? Even humans were thought to have arisen, I shouldn't say humans, the Homo group, the Homo genus, was thought to have arisen through fusion or translocation between chromosomes in the other great apes. So this model leads to an offspring that can't reproduce with either of the two parents if the translocation or translocation or chromosome number changes occurred within one species. Then we have this kind of a model where species A would continue, but the production of this species B happened instantaneously with the error in meiosis, leading to this new species. Does that make sense? And the new species, maybe because of that extra chromosome or because of this translocated piece, we changed the ratios of proteins that were being produced because we've changed the number of copies of genes in some instances and not others, resulted in a higher fitness state, where allopatric speciation, we go through this low fitness state before we can get back where we were. Sympatric speciation produces offspring that have very high fitness and often have higher fitness than the adults. Okay? Right, the other model that we can talk about, I think I have a slide for that. This would be here, is this model where we have two different species that aren't different enough, and so they can still produce offspring together under certain circumstances, and the ability to produce this offspring results in this thing called a hybrid, because we're combining two different species genomes together, and because the offspring can't reproduce with either of the two parents, what we have is actually a new species. So that's where we'll pick up with next time. I want to go into this model in more detail and then come back to this problem of no matter how you produce this new species, the result is a very rare species, and then kind of ecologically, what are we talking about happening there? Okay? All right, take care. I'll see you next time. Bye.